I am Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Liebson. What are we going to call this? The penultimate hour of the penultimate show of the inaugural week of 2018. I don't know. That sounds like a mouthful. How about just welcome back to the Seth and Chris Show? It's the 4 o'clock hour, and we are joined by our friend and colleague, Brandon Weichert. Brandon is a contributor to American Greatness. He is a Mount Vernon Fellow. He's an all-around good guy. We love him. Don't let him know that. It'll go to his head. But we're going to get Brandon on the line. He's not here yet, is he? Because I don't want him hearing all these nice things I'm saying.
I'm here.
Oh gosh. That's right. We're mass communicating here, right? This isn't just one-on-one. This is not one at a time. We've got everybody listening. Brandon, how are you? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I'm fine. How are you? Very
well indeed. Very well. Question for you. So, what a difference, what is it now, 9 years makes on the way the United States handles protests in, I guess it's 9 years now, 2009 to 2018.
That's right.
What's going on in Iran is fascinating to me. I don't know if you saw this, Brandon. Of course, we would expect the way Donald Trump handles a grassroots uprising in Iran to be different than the way that Barack Obama did, and it has been markedly different and a welcome, refreshing change. I don't know if you saw this. VOA, the Voice of America News, I had a fascinating statistic. You know what they say? They say this: one difference between 2009 and 2018 Iran protests: 48 million smartphones.
Yes.
What do you think of that? What's the implication of that?
Well, I think that's huge. One of the biggest things that, these regimes fear is the instantaneous communication that modern society and technology allow their people to have. And we do know, I remember I worked on the Hill when there were people from USAID and people from these communications groups, public diplomacy groups, that would come to our office saying, look, the Obama administration is cutting funding for things like cell phone towers that broadcast into places like Iran or Cuba, and these things for a couple $1 million have the potential to fundamentally alter the terrible regimes that exist in these countries. And for whatever reason,
right, there's a massive return on investment.
Yes, it's much more so than any amount of U.S. boots on the ground in this case could do. And it was just shocking. I remember I worked there for 3 years. It was at Christmas time because nobody would ever meet with these groups when we were in session. So it was always thrown into my lap, and I'd meet with them, and they were always depressed, and they were always coming in, and they'd always say, look, we have this cell tower that they're going to cut access off to in Cuba, and it's a couple $1 million, and we could really do some good there. Or in Iran, this really could help people in the next protest, and the Obama administration will not fund it. Will Congress fund it? And, of course, we never could get ourselves together because we don't understand public diplomacy, which is exactly what this falls under, these types of communications, using communications and our goodwill and messaging to influence foreign policies of other countries.
I like the old-fashioned phrase, ideas have consequences. So let's get them our ideas.
That's right. Or as my friend Sebastian Gorka, he used to teach at the Institute, enemy threat doctrine. You have to know your enemy threat doctrine, and then you have to be able to battle their perceptions. The technological aspect, of course, this is a means for transmitting ideas, a means for people to communicate what it is they want to do and to organize. The World Bank says that in 2009, 15% of Iranians had smartphones. The first iPhone was released in January of 2007, so 2 years earlier. Right. Now here we are 9 years hence from 2009. They say about 50% or 48 million Iranians have smartphones. Which means that texting, Twitter, and there's a million other communications apps. Well, and I don't know if you know David Goldman, but I'm friends with him, and
very well.
He's been posting on his Facebook, and then I know he just wrote an article a day or two ago on Asia Times about the protests. The video, he has a clip of one of these cell phone videos that one of the protesters took of them lighting this police station on fire at night. And I mean, it's just incredible what, a little handheld, smartphone or, whatever can sow the seeds of revolution better than any, U.S. military, any soldier could, with all due respect. It's really interesting to watch how technology is breaking down the barriers, both good and bad. Obviously, in this case, it's good. In other cases, it can be bad.
Well, in our own experience, Brandon, think about the power of the Rodney King video, without passing any judgment or wanting to reopen that old wound. But think about what that video did in this country, whatever that was, 20-some years ago. The power of a video can be really remarkable when in setting something off that was ready to go anyway. And that's the situation we have, I think, in Iran.
Absolutely. And when you look at, the Arab Spring was initiated by that street vendor, and I believe it was in, was it Morocco, or it was, I'm drawing a blank, Tunisia. It was Tunisia. And he set himself aflame, and he set himself on fire after the government came in and took his wares that he was selling, and so he had no way to make his rent, and basically he was protesting the economic conditions of that system there, which is what sparked the entire Arab Spring. Now, unfortunately, we know how that went. It became an Islamist winter. But the one thing is, it was the images and the power of the message of him lighting himself ablaze in defiance of a repressive, economically torpid regime. That's what initiated the entire social and political unrest. And that's something similar that you're seeing in Iran today. The people of Iran protesting, as we've all heard from, I've written about this at American Greatness. I've read Michael Ladine's written about this at PJ Media. David Goldman's written about it. Well, one key difference between today in Iran and 2009 Iran is that the number of people involved is much larger, and it's also a wider group of people. In 2009, it was mostly urban, young, cosmopolitan, westernized, well-educated people. Today, it's those people plus a lot of the more conservative, working class, more religious elements in the countryside as well as the cities. This is a mass movement, and they're protesting the economic conditions. And the one thing we know, that the economic conditions have been made worse in that country because of the fact that the sanctions were in place. And what happened was Obama came in with that nuclear deal, got the sanctions lifted, but when Trump was elected, the rest of the world was afraid to actually open up and do real business with Iran because they didn't know if Trump was going to slap sanctions back on and renounce the deal. Now, he didn't certify in October. I think that has also played heavily into making the economic situation so unbearable that the people of Iran have had no choice but to rebel.
I want you to explain that a little bit, maybe for people who don't follow this closely. When you say that in October President Trump didn't certify, and that led to really tightening the economic noose, which led the Iranian people to rise up on their own to try and take control of their own destiny. Explain what that means and how that works.
Well, basically, pretty much for at least 20 or 30 years, we've had varying degrees of economic sanctions against Iran that were intended to make life very tough for the Iranian regime, to the point where the hope was that they would either collapse entirely or that they would basically, be moderate. And, of course, that didn't happen. And what we do know is that in the months and years leading into the 2015 deal with the Obama administration over their nuclear weapons in Iran, we do know that it was exceptionally bad for Iran economically. And the belief among many on the right, at least, was that if we had continued upholding those sanctions and tightening them, it might have led to a collapse of that regime. And what the Obama administration did when they did the deal was they basically gave them a reprieve in Iran that allowed for Iran to become a more legitimate country in the eyes of the world. And so this actually allowed it, kind of loosened them out of their box to kind of go and do all of these endeavors they've been doing in the Middle East, to stabilizing Syria, to stabilizing Lebanon, Yemen. And so when Trump came in, the deal that Obama had signed with Iran, it required recertification every 90 days. And when Trump came in, he was very much opposed to the deal. And inevitably, when it was up for recertification this last October, he finally said enough is enough. I do not certify this deal. And that then essentially started the process of putting Iran back in its proverbial box. And that is what is playing. That is largely what's playing also into helping these protesters because the government is weakened already from the sanctions being put back on.
Brandon, hold that thought. We got to run to a break. Brandon Weichert is our guest. He's a contributor to American Greatness, friend of this program, and very, very helpful in understanding what's going on in Iran. I'm Chris. He's Seth. We'll be right back. I'm Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Leibson. Welcome back to the Seth and Chris Show. We're joined by Brandon Weichert. Want to talk about we are talking about what is going on in Iran, how to understand how we got here, what it means for the United States, and how Trump administration policy has really been instrumental in helping to bring this about. Do you think that's a fair statement, Brandon?
I didn't hear that last part. What did you say?
Do you think do you think that Trump administration policy towards Iran has been instrumental in bringing the country to the point where there is a grassroots protest movement?
Well, I think it's one of those chicken or the egg things. I think that the grassroots movement, the organic revolt, was always there, and all that we did with the Trump administration, what they rightly did, was recognize that movement was there, and then proceeded to act in a way with our policy that would undermine the regime, weaken it to a point where that organic, grounds-up movement had the momentum to burst forward. And so I think that this movement probably would have happened irrespective of what the Trump administration did, but it was the perfect confluence of events. And you throw in the Trump administration's decision to act the way they did toward Iran, and I think that it has just been a brilliant move by the current administration to kind of throw oil onto that fire.
Brandon, when you say that you think this would have happened anyway, is that I want to sort of clarify that. Do you mean someday? All regimes come to an end, or do you mean that it was imminent?
I think. So I just did an article for American Greatness on this. And David Goldman has spent many years talking about this specific issue. If you look at the fertility rates in Iran, they have been in the doldrums for a long time. They are not having enough young people. And, of course, if you're a young person in Iran or a woman, you are more than likely to be killed or tortured by the regime than any other group of people. And so the country was looking at a very bleak demographic future. And so at some point in the next decade, and I wrote this, I've also written this at my site, at some point in the next decade or the next 15 years, I really think that time was working against the current leadership because they're all in their 60s, 70s. I think that time was working against them, and that eventually there was going to be, whether it was a revolution like we're seeing now or a revolt, or if it was just the natural evolution of these young people growing up, wanting more liberal reforms, better economic circumstances, taking government power through quote-unquote legitimate means. Inevitably, in my lifetime at least, I'm 29, that this regime, if left alone, I think would have collapsed in the next 10 to 15 years. I think the fact that we added on with doing these moves in the Middle East under Trump, this has been instrumental, though, in expediting, in accelerating their arrival at a destination that they were headed towards anyway.
You have a really interesting graphic that comes from the World Bank that's in your article at American Greatness, which is called "Time is Not on the Mullah's Side." Throughout it goes back to 1960, your graphic, but basically throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, the number of births per woman, the fertility rate in Iran was over 6. It was between 6 and 7. And then it peaked sort of in the late 1980s and then just kind of walked off a cliff. Yep. And let's say basically by about 2000, it was at right at about 2 replacement, more or less. But continued going down. So between 2000 and 2015, which is when the data is from, it kept declining to the point where, for the past several years, it's been about 1.68 births per woman, the fertility rate of 1.68, which is below replacement.
Yes, because the replacement level, for those who don't know, is 2.1 births per 1,000 women. And so that's the baseline number, 2.1. That's the magic number you need to make sure you're going to at least maintain some stability in your society. And when you start dropping below that number, as Europe has done, specific Turkey has done, Iran, as we noted, has done. When you start dropping below that number and you start doing that consistently, and Russia is also doing this, you're going to have some significant socio-economic and political problems. And actually, the concern that I have long had with Iran in particular is that the more unstable and bleaker their future is, the current group of fanatics running the government, the mullahs and the president and the people who have been selected by the mullahs and the ayatollah to lead the country, my concern was that they were going to start doing things in the here and now, start acting extremely aggressively and extremely boldly, because they know that whether it's, just a lower number of people being born and not enough to sustain their society, or the young people get older and they just take the country in the direction they want to take it in, which is more moderate. This current group of leaders knew their days of being able to implement their Islamic revolution across the Middle East and the world was coming to an end. So it was either a put up or shut up moment.
Now, explain the backdrop here, Brandon. There is an impending changing of the guard just due to age within the mullahocracy. Yes. Yes.
And so with the mullahs, obviously, though, you're always going to have, because the mullahs are the most, they're the most conservative, strict. They're part of this. It's a specific branch of Shia Islam that is colloquially known as the Twelver branch. And basically, the Twelver branch of Shia Islam, they're the ones who believe, especially the mullahs, have a very literal interpretation of this form of Islam. And basically, it's apocalyptic, and they basically want to bring about, and I'm going to put it in very layman's terms here, they want to bring about basically the apocalypse or the end of the Jews and the Christians in order to create a kind of Islamic paradise on earth. And it is, and I realize that's not the precise language academics like to hear, but basically it's a very apocalyptic worldview. Now, it's not shared by everyone in the country, but the people who matter, the majority of them share this view, particularly the mullahs. And so that is the problem right now that they're dealing with. The people behind them, the young people, they tend to get more moderate. I don't know how moderate the next generation of mullahs will be, but I can tell you right now, majority, I think, of Iranian young people today are more moderate, they are more cosmopolitan, and they are more westernized. And so that in and of itself is going to, I think, lend the country to being more moderate in its foreign policy over time.
Which is what we really care about.
Yes.
Right. I mean, there's a sense of, what do you care? That's always one of those questions. I get, what does that even mean? We care in some sense about what their domestic policies are, but really, as Americans, we care about what they do outside of their borders. Right. This is the number one question for us.
Yes.
And
but we do have to, unfortunately, though, we do have to worry, particularly when there's the kind of ideology involved. We have to worry about, because the way that a country like Iran with that totalitarian, apocalyptic ideology, the Twelver ideology, the problem is how they operate domestically does inform how they're going to operate on the international stage. And so that is the one reason why, at the very least, we should always keep our eye on what's going on domestically in these countries.
Sure. Brandon, when we come back, I want to ask you this question, which is, what is a good outcome for the United States with these current uprisings? What's the yardstick that we use? What should we be hoping for? I'm Chris Buskirk. He's Seth Leibson. Brandon Weichert is our guest. We'll be right back. I'm Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Leibson, and our guest is Brandon Weichert. Brandon, before the break, I asked you to think on this question. I know it wasn't the first time you've thought about it, so you probably just had to marshal some well-developed thoughts on the subject. But when we look at Iran, we watch what's going on there. This is, in some ways, a replay of 2009, but as you said, broader. Deeper.
Yeah.
So it's better, right? This is the new and improved version of the popular protest movement in Iran. Iran is the central vector in most of the problems throughout the Middle East. Yeah?
Yeah.
Right. The way they fund terrorism, terror-related Islamic supremacist organizations throughout the Middle East, throughout the world, they're a huge problem.
Yeah.
So what is it that when we're looking at what's going on in Iran, as Americans, from an American interest, what's our yardstick? What should we want to see happen?
Well, I mean, so very clearly, we want three things. We want them to stop. We want them to denuclearize. We don't want them to have nukes. We want them to stop funding terrorism, both in the region and throughout Latin America, because people don't realize how basically large chunks of Latin America have been somewhat colonized by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And then we also want them to stop trying to wage war on their neighbors, whether it be the Sunni Arab states or, more importantly, Israel. And if we can get those three objectives, everything else is irrelevant.
Okay, so those are the things we want to see happen as a matter of Iranian policy. What are the means to achieve that?
Well, so we can either do what the Obama administration did, which is a disaster, which is to make a deal with them and try to stabilize relations. And basically, what the Obama administration did was they bought into a very, I think, skewed notion of balance of power, deterrence. Basically, they were going to. Obama wanted to, understandably, pull us out of the Middle East, except for the most, minimal amount of interaction. He wanted to pull us out of the Middle East, defer to Iran, and then use Israel and the Sunni states to balance against each other. The problem is, though, we ended up under Obama empowering Iran, weakening the Sunni Arab states, and then with the Arab Spring, and at the same time, we ended up pushing Israel away. And so that wasn't the way to do it. Another way to do it is we do the Bush doctrine, which is we go in, heavy-handed, and we send in the military, and it's regime change. It's Baghdad 03 all over again, only this time it's going to be a lot worse, which is obviously another bad idea. The only hope we have is that internal dynamics lead to a fundamental political, socio-political change in the government there, which is what's going on right now. Now, whether or not this current wave of protests is going to go the way of 09, where it failed ultimately, or it's going to go the way of 79, which is what catapulted the current evil regime into power, I contend it's irrelevant because the seeds have already been sown. They're already growing in terms of discontent. And whether it happens where this regime in the next year or whatever is in near term is overthrown, or if it happens in another 8 years, in my lifetime, this is going to happen because the youth are going to take over as time progresses. Now, I think everyone is playing it safe when I watch on the news these pundits, and they're saying, well, it's not going, this is probably not going to happen this time. I think actually this is a repeat of what happened to the end of the Soviet Union and what happened at the end of the Shah's reign in Iran. The same conditions exist in Iran today that existed in 79 that led or precipitated to the current regime's rise to power. The same type of conditions in terms of economics and social and political repression exist today in Iran that existed in the Soviet Union in 1991 when it ultimately collapsed. And remember, everyone in 1991, Robert Gates and the Democrats alike, were saying the Soviet Union's going to be here for another 40 years. And that ended up being completely wrong. And so I really think that what's going on now, the internal revolution or uprising, whatever you want to call it, that is the only hope we have to avoid a major, severe, devastating regional war with Iran. And I hope that we can continue to see positive movement in that direction.
Brandon, we're going to go to a break here, but we talk about regime changes, though that is in itself the solution. But I always ask the same question, which is, what's the replacement? Right. What is the replacement? Yeah. We see these seemingly more or less spontaneous mass demonstrations throughout Iran. It kind of looks like the analogy I like is Romania under the Ceausescu regime when that regime collapsed. But who leads? Right? What comes next? Do we have any insight into that? Do the people who study Iran closely and understand the dissident and opposition movements in Iran? We're going to go to a break. Think on that, and we'll talk about that on the other side. I'm Chris.
Okay.
That's Seth. Brandon Weichert is our guest. We're talking Iran. We'll be right back. I am Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Leibson. Welcome back to the Seth and Chris Show. Brandon Weichert's our guest, talking about Iran, talking about the protest movement in Iran that is quite a bit larger than the one that that Barack Obama helped snuff out in 2009. Brandon, we talked about what we should hope for in terms of policy coming out of Iran, what would be good for this country. Denuclearization, of course, is a big one. Stopping the financing and the export of terror is another one. There are other things that we would look for Iran to stop doing, right? But how do we get there? That's the question. This protest movement has given Americans and other people around the world some hope for that. Iran is a central vector in all kinds of problems throughout the Middle East and throughout the world. We talk about regime changes, though, that were some type of a certainty. People talked about that during the Arab Spring as well.
Right.
I remember talking with some people during the Arab Spring with regards to Egypt. Oh, great. Regime change in Egypt. They're terrible totalitarians in Egypt. What did we get instead? The Muslim Brotherhood. What if the mullahocracy falls? What is it? What would you think would be the replacement?
Well, I disbelieve that whatever would replace it would be. I don't think it would be any worse than what we have now. It might not be that much better. But ultimately, the movement today started as an economic protest. They didn't like the price of eggs. Too high. Commodities were too high, everyday things that were needed to survive, and it kind of just ballooned out from there. And it's touching everyone now. And the fact that this is an organic movement with no real leaders, the difference between now and 2009 was that the Green Movement was an organized group. It had leaders. It had people who could be targeted by the state, and they were. This one is not really well led. There doesn't seem to be any real group or movement that has a leadership here. It's just kind of happening organically and spasmodically. In Egypt, we saw a lot of an organic movement get hijacked by the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not quite sure in internal Iranian political dynamics if there is a similar. Obviously, you have the Revolutionary Guard, but they're officially part of the state. So I don't really, and this is the unknown, I don't really know what would come. We know that the Kurds at 10% of the total population, and we know that they certainly want their own country. And we know that the Baluchis are about 2% of the population in southeastern Iran, and Arabs in the southwest are 2%. And then I think the Azeri Turks are probably 15 or 16%. So you could have some divisions along ethnic lines. I would think what would form would be some sort of parliamentary system. Now, whether or not it looked like a real parliamentarian system or just a slightly less pernicious version of the Islamic Republic that we have now, I don't know. You live by the crystal ball, you're going to eat glass. So I don't want to make a prediction on that. All I know is that the current regime we cannot do business with. And we know what they want, and we know that what they want is inimical to our interests and our national security. So I think the hope is that we have to accept that if we really want real change coming from Iran, it's going to have to be regime change. We cannot be the ones to do it directly the way we did in Iraq, and it's going to be up to the people. And if it's up to the people, though, that means we're going to have to, let them figure it out. And so this is not the most optimal scenario, but I do think given the prevalence of, especially again among the youth, there is a large contingent of people who want economic freedom. And economic freedom, if granted, will lead to a greater level, I think, of moderation and stability. So I don't know.
Brandon, is there an organized opposition movement in Iran?
There used to be the Green Movement, and again, the Kurds had their own, and the Baluchis, but unfortunately, the state has been very good. The Revolutionary Guard has been very good about crushing organized opposition. And so that's another problem that this group is facing, the people that are rebelling right now. They're not organized.
Mm-hmm. And so to the extent that there was some type of regime change, whether it be today or 5 years from now, there has to be a leadership that emerges. But you're saying it doesn't seem to exist right now.
Yeah, the Mujahideen Khalq is a Marxist or previously Marxist revolutionary group. They rose up along with the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini in the 1979 revolution, but then he turned on them, so they fled into Saddam's Iraq and basically became a paramilitary force for Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. The moment they started killing Iranians, this MEK group, they lost a lot of support in Iran, but this is the same group that gave the U.S. Congress the initial intelligence on Iran's nuclear weapons program. They have been a consistent ally of ours for the last 20 years, and there's some hope, I think, among certain people in D.C., but I think this is unrealistic. There's some hope that we could use them. I think we could use them in the sense of arming them and then having them go into Iran to add on to the chaos to ultimately break the back of the regime. But the hope in D.C., it sounds like among those who do favor greater American intervention with regime change, the hope, it sounds like, is that, hey, if we organize and arm up the MEK, they'll go in and it'll be a government in a box. We'll just send the box in there and they'll open it and they'll take over. But we shouldn't want them to take over.
Please tell me there aren't people who are peddling that obviously flawed idea.
Oh yeah, well it's the same. It's the usual suspects. It's all the groups that were in favor of Ahmed Shalabi in Iraq. The MEK has tentacles. They have tentacles everywhere. Now, by the way, I'm for arming them if we're going to use them as simply a destabilizing element. But the idea of handing power to them is, first of all, they have no support in Iran itself, very little. And second of all, their Marxist background leaves much to be desired. And they have killed Americans. They killed about 12 Americans in 1979. And so this group has a very mixed history, but they did help us out in acquiring the intel on Iran's nuclear program to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a huge lobbying effort out here, and they have...
Where does their money come from?
I don't know, but I can tell you that there were elements of, there are elements not just on the left, but in the Trump campaign as well, that were taking a lot of money throughout their careers from the MEK front groups here.
Mm-hmm.
And MEK has a huge following in D.C. among both parties, the foreign policy, the usual suspects.
Right.
And so, I'm all in favor of using them as a destabilizing agent, but I'm not in favor of this idea of, well, they're going to go in, destabilize, and then they'll take power, because I can tell you what, they're probably going to end up as bloody-minded as the Ayatollah was.
Right, exactly right. They've been out of power. They probably have a long list of scores that they would like to settle. Brandon, we're going to run to a break. We got a short segment on the other side where you can kind of wrap up, give us our concluding thoughts on Iran, or your concluding thoughts on Iran, and anything else that you think has caught your eye this week in the news. I'm Chris Buskirk. He's Seth Leibson. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Seth and Chris Show. I'm Chris Buskirk. He's Seth Leibson. Our guest is Brandon Weichert. Brandon, concluding thoughts. Where do we go from here on Iran, and then anything else that has caught your eye?
Still cowed by the wonderful bumper music you have, and so, but where we go from here...
That's our intent, by the way, Brandon. We try and cow our guests with our music.
So where we go from here is, with Iran, we kind of have to let the pieces fall where they may. Obviously, Trump can continue the diplomacy of terms of building up our ties with the Sunni Arab states, as well as with Israel, to kind of contain Iran, but we kind of have to let the pieces fall where they may in Iran and just be prepared to deal with all the knock-on effects. But another thing that I've been following very closely is both on your website, the American Greatness website, as well as my website, the Weichert Report. I just published a piece today called "It's a Trap. North Korea Wants Talks with South Korea to Buy Their Nuclear Program Time." I am convinced that Kim Jong-un, because of the Juche ideology that he has, he wants to invade the South. And all of this talk about being nice to South Korea. It's all about separating South Korea from the United States. And the moment that South Korea breaks with the United States, he's going to go in, especially if he feels that he has a reliable nuclear weapons program, a nuclear weapons arsenal, which he is very close to having. All he needs is the ICBM, and he's almost there. I give it about 16 to 18 months. And so that is the thing to be watching out for as well as North Korea.
Yeah, this is interesting, Brandon, to me, is that all of a sudden now Kim Jong-un all of a sudden is trying to cozy up to South Korea. My take on this is that the South Korea is dumb enough to fall for it.
That they are dumb enough?
Oh, yeah.
You said?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think they are.
I don't think it's a close call.
It's not that they're dumb. It's that they're desperate because you see, the future they know. Everybody knows where this is going. This is leading to the North Korean, fire blitz into the South, and everybody knows it. And the South doesn't know what to do because because they have a superior military technologically and better training, but even if they're able to repel a northern invasion, they're going to lose Seoul, and Seoul, the capital of their country, is the economic engine of that country. And once you lose that, it's going to be years before the South Korean economy and political system recovers, not to mention all the people that are going to die over there. And so I think that they're just desperate and trying to convince themselves that there really is an alternative to war. And unfortunately, in this case, there isn't.
Well, on that happy note, we now know there's no alternative to war on the Korean Peninsula. Yeah, no, we'll have to. It's I laugh, but it's a serious issue. It is a serious issue.
But I don't think I am.
Yeah, no, I know, Brandon. It's troubling because South Korea, they have the problem that too many societies have. Is
if they act now with us, they can stop this from happening.
Right, but they don't want to pay the price now, so they're
right.
just going to cross their fingers and hope.
Yep.
This is the Chamberlain approach.
Yep, exactly.
Brandon,
exactly.
Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it. We'll be back after this with Michael Walsh.